In this discussion, we're going to be exploring our experiences of anxiety and struggle. For most of us, anxiety is an incredibly difficult experience to work with. It seems that there's some social fantasy that we're not supposed to feel anxious. Often we will relate to our experience of anxiety as evidence that there must be something wrong with us or that we've done something wrong. Other people don't seem to feel comfortable around us when we're anxious. But it's possible that anxiety is a completely legitimate, valid, though not pleasant, aspect of being human. And we have to learn to work with anxiety skillfully because it is part of our experience every day, actually. I know I feel anxious every day. It might be because I wasn't watching when I'm driving for a moment, or I wonder about if our kids are okay, anxious about some conflict with my partner, anxious about paying a bill, whatever. But I don't think I've ever met anybody who doesn't experience anxiety as an ongoing part of their life. So our basic choice, once again, is how we relate to anxiety. Do we relate to this disturbing experience with fundamental aggression where we try to not feel it, make it wrong, distract ourselves, or with an attitude of being committed to this experience because it's real, it's us. It's not alien. It's not an option, actually. In this discussion, I'll be talking about what could be called emotional or existential anxiety, not anxiety which results from brain chemistry, hormones, medical problems. These biologically based experiences of anxiety usually need biologically based interventions, regulating sleep, experimenting with diet, making sure we have exercise, possibly medications. These are all very appropriate. But in this discussion, we're talking about the type of anxiety that we all live with that doesn't seem to be caused by some neurological or hormonal problem. The experience of anxiety is basically that of a threat. At times of anxiety, there seem to be intense physical sensations which energize us, often a more focused attention in which we search for danger, and usually a sense of imminent catastrophe. The sense of imminent catastrophe is interesting because often we can't really say what it is we're anxious about. Sometimes fear is described as an immediate response to an immediate threat. If we're hiking and suddenly hear a big noise, we might feel some fear. But if we're hiking and we feel anxious, it's going to be about the possibility of what could happen. So anxiety serves almost like a preparation for our survival response. It's getting us ready for the possibility of a threat. Both fear and anxiety are at the center of our biology. Our species probably wouldn't be here if we didn't have fear and anxiety. If our ancestors had felt just at peace and happy and sunning themselves on a rock, they'd probably have gotten eaten up. So fear is very necessary as part of an evolutionary process. Another interesting quality of anxiety is that it seems to be very contagious. For example, if you see a flock of birds, suddenly one bird will startle and the whole flock in a fraction of a second takes off, or a herd of deer suddenly, almost together, runs away. I think most of us have had the experience that in relationships, when a person we care about is anxious, it's very difficult to not feel anxious ourselves. Whereas if somebody else feels sad or angry, if they're jealous, if they're somehow having some reaction about their life, oftentimes we're not so affected. We can keep more distance. But anxiety is very deeply embedded, very contagious, and it's very difficult to work with. We all seem to carry a biologically based instinct to avoid anxiety whenever possible and to make it go away as quickly as possible if we are forced to feel it. This is, of course, intelligent if there is a threat. As humans, though, our experiencing is not only on the biological level anymore, but also on the emotional, cognitive, and spiritual levels. And in an unexamined way, we often react to the anxiety of disturbance on these levels as if our literal physical survival were at risk. Most of us, in fact, organize our experiencing to a significant extent around the avoidance of certain feelings, thoughts, and sensations which are associated with intense levels of anxiety. The therapeutic approach to anxiety is basically developmental. In the first years of life, as we've talked about, we're subjected to intense emotions and sensations which we're really not capable of processing or metabolizing, digesting, making use of in that way. And these intense, energetic, emotional experiences threaten to overwhelm our very fragile sense of self and thus provoke intense anxiety. We construct defenses as quickly as possible that reduce this anxiety, basically from a disconnection from, a repression of, these disturbing energies. This is actually a sacrifice of a part of ourselves that arises through the use of such defenses as repression, disconnection, later on intellectualization, or dissociation, where we basically are trying to get away from this perceived threat. But this sacrifice of a part of ourselves that's disturbing allows our more conscious sense of self to operate relatively free of anxiety. The cost, however, is a fundamental sense of being divided against oneself. We tend to create as character structure a positive self, sometimes called ego, associated with the ability to function and survive, a very positive thing, of course, and a negative not-self associated with energies which threaten this ability. This effort to avoid anxiety is the activity of our health and intelligence. It's very appropriate, very creative. It requires incredible discipline to learn how to not feel what we're actually feeling in a very consistent way. But by organizing around the avoidance of these intense feelings, such as grief, rage, fear, we paradoxically place these worst fears at the center of our sense of self. When I'm working with people, I sometimes enact just a visualization in which I hold out as far away from myself as possible something that I don't want to feel, for example. So I stretch my arm out as if that's where, for me, let's say, my dependency would be. And I'm trying to get as far away from it as possible. Of course, it's still me, so I can't actually leave it behind. But I can push it off to the side as far as possible and then pretend that it's taken care of and get on with my life. So in this enactment, I just walk forward as if things are settled and taken care of. But because massive amounts of my awareness, intelligence, discipline, creativity are going to making sure I never do anything to have to feel, let's say, dependent, the actual result is I tend to begin rotating around, organizing around that central feeling. So I end up actually walking in a circle while I think I'm going forward. Sometimes, by the time somebody's in their 30s or 40s, they start to wake up to these repetitive habitual patterns and are sort of curious, mystified, why do I keep doing these things? I see that they're not to my benefit, but I don't seem to be able to stop. Well, that's when we need to investigate the possibility that we are maintaining these patterns basically in a ritualized avoidance strategy, almost like a planet around the sun, where, ironically, the very feeling, experience that we've dedicated our life to not feeling has become the very center of our sense of self. And it's not a very positive, workable feeling sense of self. It's actually, we relate to it as quite problematic and threatening. So when somebody's ready to challenge their historic conditioning, they actually have to be committed to going into their worst fears and dissolve that organization of avoidance. As they recognize what they don't want to feel, bring it back into immediate embodied experience. Unfortunately, it doesn't make that experience go away, but it now leaves us free to go where we want in our life, because we know now that we will feel those feelings. But we gradually gain the confidence of, so what? What I feel weak or victim-y or dependent, let's say, for my organization. So what I feel hurtful and alone and selfish for somebody else's organization. So what? They actually turn out just to be feelings. From a Buddhist point of view, this organization actually gives rise, at least on a relative level, to a very convincing sense that we must have some central, essential nature, because it's always there. And once again, not only is it always there, but it's a problematic nature. By revolving around this central point over and over and over every day of our young life for decades, experientially we become convinced there must be a central point because we're revolving around it. And then we can spend our life, of course, in therapy or spiritual practices trying to somehow heal or take care of this problematic self. In spiritual practices, we might try to have an experience of no self. We think that will solve it for us. But it's, of course, at that point still motivated by a fundamentally paranoid attitude toward our own experiencing. From this Buddhist point of view, when we actually pull what has been disowned back into our own embodied experience and found it not to be actually a threat, then interestingly enough, we begin to dissolve our sense of having an essential self. We have no center to our life. We just show up every day and deal with our life as it happens. It's an interesting transition. This stabilized structure of trying to not feel anxious, not feel feelings that we are anxious about, unfortunately stabilizes, as we've discussed, the sense of being divided against oneself. This in turn generates chronic, though largely unconscious, anxiety and paranoia, a distrust in oneself, a sense of basic flaw, and many of the issues commonly worked with in psychotherapy. Freud's view of anxiety was, at one point at least, that anxiety was a signal. It was called signal anxiety, that unconscious material was threatening to be experienced consciously. It's interesting that we could also understand that view as a signal for the potential of the work of integration, that the anxiety itself is a signal that there is something that has been disowned, and maybe we ought to check it out. This chronic anxiety, though, that actually is structural, is a result of our refusal to stay fully embodied in our present experience for historically very understandable reasons, usually gives rise to a process that could be called binding anxiety. It refers to the ways in which anxiety is contained, ritualized. We try to bring it under control, to explain it. We compartmentalize it. This allows the rest of our sense of self to feel relatively free of anxiety. So it's a very understandable and, as a young child, healthy choice to sacrifice a part of ourself as if it's a problem, as if it's the location, the cause of our anxiety. But it results in what is then experienced as a symptom, a problem. Once we have a symptom or a problem, then of course we can have the fantasy that if this is the cause of our anxiety, then of course if we solve our problem, we can have a life free of anxiety. But as we have discussed, if this problem actually were solved, then we would be at risk, which we intuitively know, I believe, of having to have a direct, unexplained relationship with the fact that anxiety is actually going to continue to arise off and on until we die. And most of us don't like that idea. So let's say somebody has a style of procrastination or avoiding social events or behavioral rituals of some type. By having this repetitive, apparent problem, they can somewhat unconsciously say, well, that's why I'm anxious. I'm anxious because I'm not going to get my paper done on time. I'm anxious because I got invited to that party and I don't know whether I should go or not. If only I could solve that problem, then I wouldn't be anxious, because that's the cause of my anxiety. That's where it all is. I'm not anxious in other parts of my life. So it's a very compelling sort of drama for most of us to believe that our anxiety is caused by this familiar issue. On a group level, this also operates for almost all groups, where most groups are not actually very conscious and skillful in dealing with the anxiety that's guaranteed when a number of people relate to each other. And so it's almost inevitable in most groups that there will be what's called a scapegoating process. And that's basically the same dynamic operating now at the level of a group, where the group members who really don't want to feel a certain feeling, like anger, let's say, select a subgroup, and that subgroup usually is made up of people or a person who has the greatest unresolved issues, the weakest boundaries around that specific energy, let's say about anger. So this person volunteers and the group appoints them to be the location of the problem, the symptom. If only we could get rid of this person, then our group would be great. And in a very powerful inductive process, this person then ends up not only expressing, let's say, their own anger, but the anger for the rest of the group too. The rest of the group gets to feel relatively free of anger, and therefore of anxiety. But this person then becomes the obvious problem, and the next step usually is to get rid of the problem. So in most groups, there tends to be a type of serial scapegoating, because when we've gotten rid of that person or group that seems to be the angry people and we're all sort of nice people, it's only a matter of time till we unconsciously start to experience anger arising because it's still there. So now we have to find a new group or a new person to be the location of the problem. So this is a very challenging issue to work with in families and work groups and as a therapist in group dynamics. A Buddhist approach to the question of anxiety, in a way that won't be a surprise, is that the focus is on how we relate to our experience rather than what our experience happens to be. When we try to deny the truth of our experience, there's a price tag. We use some version of fundamental aggression toward experiences that feel threatening, that we don't like. And because the appearance of being a significant, continual, alienated self seems very vivid, we tend to take this appearance as if it must be a representation of reality. So if we start with the experience, the assumption that yes, because the sense of self appears to be so obviously there, it must be there, then, of course, we're going to try to protect and improve this self. This is a sort of a relative understanding of what could be called the egoic process, the process through which we generate and maintain the experience of a solid, continuous, significant, and personal self. But unfortunately, this project of selfhood is never successful. As we are aware of our daily ongoing experiencing, we're going to find that everything is actually always changing. We can never solve our life and just come up with a formula and then coast, although many of us try. We find suffering that we can't make go away. And if we investigate, we find an inability to ever grasp or even know this apparent self. So the inevitable consequence of our identifying with a self is a pervasive and chronic anxiety, as our efforts to feel safe and comfortable are constantly undermined by the evidence of our actual experiencing. Anxiety can be understood, then, as the accurate perception of the basically open nature of life, of mind, but from the reference point of egoic process. That's the reference point, let's say, of that aspect of our experience of ourself that, understandably, always wants to feel comfortable, happy, safe, secure, in control, and so on. That part of us, when faced with the reality of how open everything is, basically freaks out. So we could understand anxiety from a Buddhist point of view as an accurate perception of the fundamentally open nature of life, of mind, but from the reference point of egoic process. From that point of view, we could see that anxiety actually is a necessary part of our path of moving in the direction of waking up, in increasing our tolerance of more and more awareness or open mind. We could understand anxiety actually as an approximation of open mind. So anybody committed to a spiritual path, in my experience, at some point or another has to be willing to commit to the experience of anxiety. What I mean by committing to our anxiety is to do the difficult work, which goes against our biology, of training ourselves to, first of all, not try to get out of our anxiety, and even to appreciate it, explore it, feel it, see for ourselves if feeling anxiety is going to be a problem. If it's not a problem, and we understand that anxiety actually is an essential part of our path of waking up, then we might want to practice this attitude of commitment, saying, I am ready to feel anxious at any second and work with it for the rest of my life. If we wanted to, we could just examine in our daily life and see if that has any relevance. So let's say my partner is late coming home by some significant period of time. I'll probably feel some anxiety, or if my kids are. If I'm going to go to the doctor and there's some sort of problem, I will probably feel anxious. If I'm going to change jobs, I probably will feel anxiety. But if we look at that, each of those situations is really forcing us into an acknowledgement about how open our life actually is. Yes, my partner could be in an accident. Yes, I could have undiagnosed cancer. Maybe I won't be successful in my new career. All of those things are completely possible. There's no guarantee of happy endings. So if we wanted, we could look in our daily life and watch for moments of anxiety and see, am I anxious because I'm being, it feels like, forced into a direct acknowledgement, perception, experience that I actually don't know. Anything could actually be happening. But from an egoic point of view, I don't like that experience. If we really examine our experience, we may find we don't really know anything that's important. Do we really know who we are? Do we know the meaning of life? Do we know how to have healthy intimacy? Do we know what happens when we die? Do we even know if we should be doing this work or living in this town? It seems to me that upon investigation we'll find we don't really know anything that's important in our life. A lot of us even don't know what we want to eat for dinner tonight. So once again, if anxiety is going to be our egoic response to the truth of not knowing, openness, then we really might want to consider committing to our experience of anxiety. An interesting way to understand an idea in Tibetan Buddhism, which is called Bardo, is to not just stop at the more religious version, which is basically, simplistically, that after death, one's awareness continues to move through a series of experiential realms, each less open than the one before it, more form-like, more solid and contractive. And that the idea is that when that awareness can finally tolerate the degree of openness, and we could say anxiety, of a particular realm, then that's the realm in which it reincarnates. That's where it can operate. But it can't tolerate more open states of mind, so it can't stay there. It can't incarnate into more openness than it can handle. I have no idea what happens when I die, so I'm more interested actually in applying that metaphor to the way our minds work on a daily basis. So we could consider that moment after moment after moment, we are incarnating into particular states of mind, into certain sort of attitudes, positions, beliefs, roles, and that the state of mind that we incarnate into at any moment basically is a result of the amount of openness, anxiety that we can tolerate. So it's very interesting to me to watch sometimes and see, well, what sort of state of mind am I incarnating into in this moment? And I wonder if that's an expression of how much openness, how much anxiety I seem to be able to tolerate at the moment. We could also use the language that we've used of metabolizing and consider that our practice from this point of view is to gradually learn to tolerate, to contain in our embodied experience more and more and more anxiety, so that we can gradually integrate or bring into our daily life more and more experience of open mind or awareness. From either point of view, from the developmental psychotherapy point of view, from the Buddhist point of view, we are left with a dilemma. Our efforts to avoid the truth of our experiencing result in chronic anxiety. We unconsciously manifest a variety of symptoms which appear to contain and explain this anxiety. We then seek relief from these symptoms, of course, but if we were to successfully resolve these problems, as I said, we would lose the distractive functions they provide and possibly have to examine the root causes of our anxiety. From a therapeutic or developmental view, we would then be faced with our worst fears, our core emotional vulnerabilities. From a Buddhist or fruitional view, we would be faced with our raw, immediate experiencing, which provides no support for personal identity. Our dilemma, then, is that we either avoid the truth of our experiencing and have the intense disturbance of chronic anxiety, or we commit to the truth of our experiencing and have the intense disturbance of emotional vulnerability and of no support for personal identity. Until we train ourselves to rest in the experience of anxiety and disturbance and find out for ourselves that we are not harmed, and to understand these difficult experiences as completely legitimate and valid parts of life, we of course will unconsciously look for some way out, some formula, or at least some reliable distraction. A fundamental response to this dilemma is the creation of polarized life dramas. We represent the truth of our disturbance, reality, as a fear, and the truth of our wish to have an end to disturbance and to have a life of safety and comfort as a hope. When we add the fantasy of resolution to these contradictory and apparently mutually exclusive experiences, this then binds or captures our attention within the drama. And because of the anxiety associated with our fears, we usually have a vague sense that the resolution of this drama is of survival level importance, that the outcome will determine our worth as a person or the viability of our lives. At this point, we've created an incredibly resilient and stable psychic structure, struggle. Let's say that I feel unworthy of love. So now I'm afraid to feel this feeling. It's a horrible feeling. It goes way back in my life. I want to just collapse or explode in rage when I feel this feeling. So, of course, I come up with a goal of feeling loved. And then I begin to behave in ways that I hope will give me the feeling of being loved. I'm kind, generous, I avoid conflict, and so on. With the hopes that someday I'll achieve this goal. Then I'll be able to show up. I'll be able to be okay. And until then, there's really a lot at stake. This is a really, really significant issue. My worth as a person is on the line. This is very fascinating to us. But it's possible that I already feel unworthy of love. It's an historic issue, deeply conditioned. It's unlikely that I ever will get rid of this issue. So another possibility is just to experience this very difficult vulnerability, to let myself feel unworthy of love, and then see if I'm harmed. Having come up with this strategy of struggle, we then have developed a pretty effective defense against feeling anxiety in a straightforward way. So at this point, we're going to shift our discussion to the nature of struggle itself and how to work with it. Struggle has been defined as a continued effort to resist force or to free oneself from constraints. It's a dictionary definition. The core struggle for most of us is that we want things to be different than they are. We don't want fear and intense negative emotions. We don't want to become sick and die. We don't want the incomprehensible violence in this world to continue, and so on. Very understandable. Neurotic struggle, then, could be understood as a continued effort to resist reality or to free oneself from its constraints. We could imagine finding ourselves in prison, maybe unjustly accused and convicted, and we're there for life. Now our question is, well, now what? How do we relate to this injustice, this fact that I'm in prison now? We can either struggle against the reality that we are unfairly in prison, but that doesn't get us out of prison. It's possible that, in fact, we may end up feeling even more claustrophobic and enraged and basically in hell. It does serve, though, to distract us from the deep grief and powerlessness that we would have to feel if we were actually to acknowledge that this is the truth of our situation. All of us, in fact, are imprisoned, we could say, in the constraints of body, gender, our history, race, life and circumstances, and so on. And most of us struggle as a type of distraction, so we don't really have to consciously participate in what it's like to be so claustrophobic, so imprisoned, so constrained by reality. We really are holding on to our fantasies of a life without limitation. So neurotic struggle has a function. It's not just a bad idea. It serves a purpose. And until we're ready to be present, embodied, kind toward the truth of our experience, which is very disturbing on a certain level, we will have an investment in maintaining neurotic struggle because of its distractive function. To maintain struggle, to be most effective, a strategy of resisting reality will have several features. One is that it will operate at a basically unconscious level, because if we're aware of what we're defending against, it's not such a great defense. It will adequately incorporate our actual experiencing without directly working with it. So, for example, I work with many people who in some way or another say, yes, I really want to work with that issue. I really want to get to the depth of things. And that's their claim. So they are claiming that they really want to work with their core vulnerabilities, but then there's always a reason. I'm not ready for it yet. It's too scary. My life circumstances are really pretty busy, and now's not a good time. My partner doesn't support me, and so on. And a third quality will be that this strategy for resisting reality is self-perpetuating, meaning it has its own life. We don't have to keep attending to it once it's set in place. And this is the elegance of struggle. Although we consciously believe we want to resolve our struggles, our unconscious investment is actually to guarantee their continuity in order to maintain the avoidant functions that they serve. By acknowledging the actual existence of our disowned energies, but placing them in the unworkable version of dangerous and overwhelming fear, we can believe we're really dealing with reality, but are just not ready to go too deep. And our refusal to acknowledge reality creates the experience of alienation and disconnection, which generates chronic anxiety, which provides a continuing sense of imminent threat, which activates our distrust of ourselves and of life, which then justifies our various styles of not being open to reality, which then generates alienation and so on. So struggle is an incredibly complex, effective way to pretend to ourselves that we're really dealing with our life, we're really trying to solve these symptoms, these problems, if only whatever, and simultaneously guaranteeing that nothing will really happen. Struggle operates on 3 distinct levels. We could call them content, process, and basic. All 3 levels operate simultaneously, though one's energetic sort of investment tends to progress from content to process to basic when one is committed to some path of waking up. This progression could also be understood as a movement from disowning energies to owning energies to experiencing energies without either owning or disowning. The content level of struggle concerns specific fears and disturbances. It's about improving the story of one's life, about successfully eliminating the problems which seem to threaten us. In the therapeutic view, it is about pre-neurotic experiencing. That's before we've achieved the capacity for stabilized, repressive, dissociative function. And again, this is usually an achievement around 4, 5, 6 years old for most people. So without these skills and structures which allow us to stabilize repression, we have to then address an endless succession of life circumstances to try to soothe our anxiety, to make us feel safe. Some among an almost limitless number of strategies might be to guarantee a certain distance in relationship, which then, of course, helps us not feel too anxious about too much intimacy and vulnerability. Another strategy is to project our disturbance onto other people. So we're always trying to solve our issues through other people. Denial, distraction, stress management, exercise, meditation, all of these can be used basically to try to soothe our anxiety. Supportive life circumstances. Most people actually unconsciously spend their lives trying to create life circumstances that will feel supportive and positive and not provoke their anxiety. Of course, one of the problems is that the more successful we are at co-creating life circumstances that feel safe, then sooner or later we start to feel more dead because we're not engaged with the spontaneity and unpredictability of things. As we will discuss in the relationship session, what we often end up doing then is to hire a partner who is sort of the representation of the other, of what we can't control. The benefit is that we then feel more aliveness to give us some relief from this safe little world we've created. But the flip side of that coin is that this person is a threat to our safety and our comfort. So then we end up with a very complicated, ambivalent relationship to this person in our life. In the Buddhist view, the content level can be seen as working with the story about what we're trying to possess or avoid or ignore. These are the 3 styles of fundamental aggression that we've discussed before. At this stage, we're still trying to manipulate our life so that we feel safe and secure. In both of these views, the goal of relating directly to open awareness is seen as a possible future achievement, because one's sense of self is seen as basically problematic. A continuing struggle to eliminate problems and heal wounds, dissolve obstacles, and feel good about oneself is accepted without examination. Of course, that's what it's about. My whole life is about trying to feel good and avoid feeling bad. The process level of struggle concerns the experiential atmosphere created by splitting off conscious from unconscious, mind from body. And this is actually, in other words, the accomplishment of neurotic organization, which has incredible benefits, but the price tag of a stabilized sense of discomfort that's not really associated with any specific content at this point. It comes from feeling split against oneself in an ongoing way. So at the first level of struggle, we tend to focus on life circumstances as the cause of our difficulty, and anxiety sort of comes and goes. When things are going well, we feel okay. When they're not, we don't. But that's a little bit like being a child at the mercy of the parents' moods. So as soon as possible, most of us learn to suppress our disturbance in a ongoing way, which of course then leads to ongoing or chronic anxiety. But at this level, enough confidence has been gained that we can take on the project, if interested, in recovering experiential ownership of that which has been disowned. We feel stable enough, safe enough, sort of self-contained enough that we don't feel just at the mercy of immediate circumstances. We feel some degree of trust in ourselves. Because we've developed the sense of being an adequately intact self, we can now risk relating to other in a more confident way. And this is the realm of most Western depth therapies, where the basic intention is to make conscious that which has been unconscious. So most Western therapies are focused on an exploration about what got repressed when we were young, growing up, what is still repressed, and can we start to bring that out into open awareness with the benefit of feeling more integrated as a person. Of course, one problem is that we will never make all of our experience conscious. There's a lot of research that seems to be consistently supported in the last 20 or 30 years that 95%, roughly, of what we experience never arises into conscious awareness. Massive amounts of experiencing, processing, decision-making is being made without any conscious participation. So we can practice an attitude of being receptive to our unconscious experience. But I think it's extremely unlikely that we will ever be fully conscious of everything we're experiencing. So this is an unending project, and some therapies, in fact, seem unending. In the Buddhist view, this level of process can be seen as working with the tendency to subtly define and orient oneself based on emotional energy, to confirm one's existence based on the experience of other. That can be other in a relationship, or most subtly, it's other in terms of sort of how am I doing relating to, let's say, my anxiety, my fears, my sanity. But there's still this sense of split that's going on, although it's much better. In both views, there's an increasing sense of confidence, but there usually remains an identification with one's conscious experiencing and a subtle investment in the project of improvement, in the struggle to be more fully alive, more embodied, more present, more wakeful. Of course, all of those things are wonderful, and beneath the display, there's still the sense of project, as if who I am in this moment is somehow deficit, somehow not quite okay yet. It's not quite okay for me to show up fully in my life, to engage. The basic level of struggle concerns the way in which this unending display of our experience is unconsciously used as a distraction from the nature of open mind. What I mean is that, let's say, to return to the metaphor of the movie, when we're captured by the movie, we completely lose any sense of awareness of the environment within which that movie is being shown. The more fascinating the movie, the more complete we are captured. So all of us seem to be fascinated with the endless display of thoughts, feelings, hopes, fears, engagement with our perceptions, the whole deal. And it is unconsciously used as a distraction from open mind, awareness, whatever we want to call that larger context of open intelligence and perception, because, once again, that open experience that has no qualities that can ever be grasped provides absolutely no support for personal identity. This level of struggle is usually not addressed by mainstream Western therapies because of the largely unquestioned belief in a separate self. So psychotherapy, of course, is organized around the effort to improve one's experience of the self. But it's pretty straightforward. But in the Buddhist view, this question of how the relative experience of form and limitation is related to the absolute experience of open mind and freedom is the focus of the fruitional view. Having described these three levels of content, process, and basic levels of struggle, perhaps it would be helpful to just give some examples of how this may actually show up in clinical work. Actually, a number of people that I've worked with have moved through the first two levels quite well. It's more rare that somebody sort of gets the third level, but some people become very interested in that question. So it's very common at the beginning of somebody's therapeutic work that they are looking outside of themselves for either the cause of their problems or the solution to their problems. This is most vivid for me in relationship work, but it happens for everyone. But let's say that in many couples that I work with, the initial presentation when a couple first comes in is that each person basically is blaming the other person for their experience. And so their unconscious solution that they have in mind, sometimes it's not so unconscious, is that you should change so that I don't feel disturbed. And it's often accompanied by a whole list of what's wrong with the other person. What that person, those two people, don't understand is that by placing the cause of their disturbance outside of themselves, they're missing the opportunity to develop the capacity to deal with their own disturbance. They're basically saying, my life would be so much better if only you would be who I want you to be and not who you are. Of course, that's something of a formula for chronic conflict and actually some very destructive experience in relationship. So this first level of content has to do with our efforts to change the world, to change our life circumstances in a more sophisticated way, to change our feelings so that we will feel safe, less anxious, happier. When a person, or let's say this couple, has adequately practiced personal responsibility, is curious about the fact that their disturbance seems to be something they've lived with actually their whole life. They can remember as a child feeling unloved or like they had to be the junior parent or whatever their issue was. They start to realize that actually this is an issue that I have within myself, and it's being triggered very intensely in this relationship, which is what relationships do. But this person, my partner, is not the cause and so will not be the solution. At that point, that person, or hopefully both people in the relationship, become interested in, well, seeing how I'm stuck with these difficult feelings, maybe I should investigate them and learn to work with them. Perhaps I actually will feel more personal power if I stop putting my well-being in somebody's hands who I have no real control over. So this is the work that is sort of the meat and potatoes of Western therapy. It's the work that most therapists do, of trying to dissolve this stabilized struggle within ourself between what we consciously want to feel and what we are unconsciously afraid we will have to feel, and of course, which life triggers. In therapy, the first type of work, based more on trying to have good experiences, is considered pre-Oedipal work. It has to do with support, with calming anxiety. And so working with a person at that pre-Oedipal level of experiencing, where they're still trying to only feel good, appropriately requires the therapist to be very supportive, maybe even be a bit of a cheerleader, to not confront them too much, teach them very concrete life skills, and basically be sort of a soothing parent from that point of view. When somebody enters the stage of organization of process, where they realize that their unresolved issues, their vulnerabilities, are their responsibility to work with, then the therapist's job actually shifts quite a bit, which is into what is called uncovering work, which provokes anxiety. The intention is actually to bring up exactly what that person doesn't want to feel. So even though many people in therapy begin with the unexamined agenda that I only want to feel happy, why can't a marriage only feel positive and supportive? If they progress in their work, most people in my experience somewhat naturally go into a willingness to look into their own unconscious. And it comes out of a confidence that comes out of the willingness to be responsible for our own experience. So at that level, when I'm working with somebody, I start to experience that person as actually manifesting as an adult now. They're saying, oh, well, this sucks. I hate this. This is hard. But, I got it. This is really my issue, isn't it? And so at that point, the therapeutic work is to, in an appropriate way, keep bringing up anxiety-provoking issues so that that person gets the opportunity to investigate them for themselves and see, is it actually a problem? Some people I work with, usually people who have some practice, some spiritual practice, but sometimes I'm completely surprised by somebody who seems to be completely naive about therapy or spiritual practice, but some people just seem to be immediately curious about the question of, well, what is the nature of awareness? What has been aware of all this drama I've been going through? For some people, it's almost like a little light bulb goes off or a shift of perspective happens, and they start saying, yeah, that's really interesting. If I check into my experience, I think I can get it that my experience isn't disturbed when I'm disturbed. I can even feel it a little bit, that my awareness is not disturbed when I am feeling disturbed. That's really interesting. So some people, and I can never predict who, actually seem to have a certain type of instinctual resonance with that level of experiencing. But that's not the usual work in therapy. So we've been talking about a progression, a movement, a path from content to process to basic levels of struggle. Another way of talking about this progression, which is very necessary for most of us, that we go through these stages, is the biological metaphor of interiorization. In biology, over the course of evolution, organisms have gradually displaced their vital functions from the outside, the exterior, progressively inwardly to the interior. So a more primitive life form, let's say like a single-celled amoeba or something, is incredibly dependent upon its environment. If the salinity of the water changes, it's dead. But by the time you're getting to mammals and humans, most of the very vital functions are inside the body. And that allows that being to adapt to an incredibly wide range of environments and life circumstances. So as a metaphor, this progression that we're discussing could be understood as a process of interiorization, where we're gradually locating our sense of self, of well-being, in a more and more and more interior way, and less dependent on life circumstances, most of which we really don't have much control over. So as our location of well-being becomes more interior, we actually are able to maintain a good state of mind in a wider range of experiences. In the last discussion, we talked about this idea of learning to have a good state of mind regardless of circumstances. So as we move in a direction that is less and less dependent on circumstances, of course, that capacity is cultivated. Working in either the therapeutic or the Buddhist way at this level involves the same intention of relaxing struggle. Relaxing struggle dissolves the apparently significant dramas of resolution we create. As we gradually allow our various hopes and fears to coexist simultaneously, we find there is in fact no resolution necessary or even possible. Experiencing the immediate reality of our worst fears doesn't kill us, while experiencing the immediate reality of our greatest hopes doesn't save us. Both are only transient energies which arise, dwell, and fall away. Being equally willing to consciously participate in either negative or positive feelings, we begin to cultivate an attitude of non-bias. Without the stabilized contraction of attention, which creates a stabilized sense of self, we find that not knowing who we are does not make us dysfunctional, but instead gives rise to the experience of freedom, unconditional confidence, and open-heartedness. On an even deeper level, relaxing struggle may give rise to an experience of empty nature, because solidity actually is maintained by struggle, which is based on fundamental aggression toward reality. So as we relax struggle, the immediacy of our experience becomes more and more vivid to us. It doesn't mean that we lose our capacity to plan for the future or remember the past. It doesn't mean that our relative experiencing somehow is lost. It just means that now there's this experiential dialogue going on at all times, where our thoughts, our plans, our strategies arise, and simultaneously we are increasingly aware of our immediate experience, which has no quality of problem to it. So, as we do this work, we may find that habitual patterns actually give rise to an experience of openness. Complaints give rise to a sense of what could be called natural perfection. It doesn't mean everything's perfect like we like it, or it couldn't be improved. It just means at any given moment there is no alternative reality. At any given moment, that's it. It's as it is. So it's perfect in the sense of being complete and unitive at that moment. The next moment, of course, things will change. And our basic attitude of strategy may start to give rise to spontaneity. So if there were one point that I would hope that you might consider from this discussion, I think it would be to consider the practice, which is counter-instinctual, of committing to and welcoming the experience of anxiety as an approximation of open mind. and to be very, very curious about whether, despite all of our biological inheritance, the experience of anxiety actually is an accurate signal that our survival is at risk. So our next discussion will be about body awareness.